Mr. Lee for the generosity and nobility that makes this series possible, and to the University of Hong Kong for this very kind invitation. It's essentially my first time in Hong Kong, and I'm finding it very inspiring and exciting to discover what little I've been able to discover so far. I'd also like to thank Professor Tui, Vice-Chancellor, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Roland Chin, Pro-Vice-Chancellor S.P. Chow, Dean Daniel Chua, and Carlo Umberto. Grazie. So thank you for this invitation. Well, as Umberto said, as we shift our focus of interest in studying language away from the monolithic to the diverse, and I think being in Hong Kong, one cannot not be aware of the impact of two giant languages, the two colossuses of the world, and two civilizations in intimate and daily and somehow unyielding contact. We need to look at diversity, but there is so much of it there, and I want tonight to give you some glimpses of what there is, how fragile it is, and how valuable it is. The Tower of Babel, of course, is well known from the Old Testament as a punishment upon human beings for their presumption in wanting to build a tower to the heavens. And mankind was punished in the view of the Abrahamic traditions by being split across many languages and condemned to mutual incomprehension that would prevent us ever collaborating to the point of challenging the Almighty again. One of my favourite authors, Jorge Luis Borges, has written this wonderful short story called The Library of Babel, which in your new introductory courses I think should be an obligatory reading for everyone. It's just so compact and beautiful. And his idea was that here's this giant library full of hexagonal wings, full of books, which contained everything written in any language, sayable in any language, truths, untruths, gibberish, and so on. It's all there. And we can think of this as a metaphor for all human knowledge. And we can think of one role of the humanities as providing us with a sense of value and discernment that allows us to find what's really useful in there from all the junk. And anyone who surfs the internet every day knows how important discernment is, and how there are not and unlikely ever to be the perfect search engines which will find us the most enlightening and good things. They can help, but they can't take us all the way. Yet this Babel, or if we think of each wing or each room of this library as being what a particular culture, what a particular language has, many wings of this library can be thought of as burning down around the world as we speak. And the Senegalese writer and philosopher and representative to UNESCO, Modo Ampatempa, said this beautiful thing in an address he made to UNESCO early in the 1960s, that an old person dying is a library burning. And that's all the more so when that old person may be the last repository of a language. I've had the sad personal experience myself of being at a funeral, burying someone in the book and volume of whose brain was contained all the knowledge of a language and a culture, which, because this was not a written language, we had never had time to put in an abiding form. And part of the quest of documentary linguistics is to try and give some permanence to this intricacy. There's another aspect to it, which is the assistance to communities wanting to make sure that children get the chance to learn their languages. That's a much more difficult task. In a way, the task we know how to solve is, even though it's a complex one, is how to record and try and plumb all of the knowledge. I mean, just imagine yourselves, any one of you, if you were the last representative of your culture, somehow transplanted to another planet, and people wanted to ask you, what did you Earthlings or Hong Kongers, Cantonese, whatever, have in your culture? It would all be there in your brain, or at least a lot of it. Now, language diversity is very unevenly distributed around the world. And this is a map of the world where countries have been scaled according to the number of indigenous languages in them. And you'll see that the great powers, you'll be used to these maps from gross national product or something like that, or population. The great powers are in unexpected places, like in Papua New Guinea, like in Nigeria, Cameroon, India, Indonesia. You can't really see Vanuatu there, which I'll talk about in a moment. And other areas, well, here you can compare the United States, which is shrinking with the tragic loss of lots of its languages, with Mexico, which has exuberant linguistic diversity there, and much of it, surprisingly, still hanging on today. Now, I'm sure you're interested in this part of the world, and the fact that it appears much smaller than you might expect, and that's a topic to which I will return briefly at the end of this lecture. I won't say more about it at the moment. The world champion for linguistic diversity is the tiny Pacific nation of Vanuatu, population around 205,000. So I was just checking on the internet this morning at districts of Hong Kong. So Yau Tsin Long has a larger population than the Pacific nation of Vanuatu, which has 105 indigenous languages, plus English and French, because it was an English-French condominium, plus Bishlama, which is the Creole, which is the national language. So an average number of speakers per language is of around 2,000. It's quite stunning to think of that if one speaks a language like English or Chinese with hundreds of millions, or perhaps billions of speakers, depending how we do the count. And this map just shows you all the languages in Vanuatu. Now that's a measure just based on counting how many languages there are. If we ask why you get this linguistic diversity, and if we return or turn away from the Tower of Babel myth to stories found in other parts of the world explaining why there should be so many languages, you come to Northern Australia, which I'll take as an example, where the founding figure for the cosmos was a woman called Waramuragunti, and she emerged pregnant from the sea on the north coast of Australia. She'd come across the sea from Indonesia, pregnant with quite a lot of children, and as she walked through the landscape, she put her children there. She put different plant resources there, water lilies in one place, lotuses in another place, yams in another place, characteristic of each ecology. And she told people in their clans, this is in the Iwaja language, Rukaku Nangani, I'm putting you here. Riki Angalama, you speak this way. Rukanui Nuogin, this is your language. So she's deliberately creating languages, and people say, this is so everyone knows who they are. And most importantly, that no one is so arrogant as to think that they have a monopoly on all language, on all knowledge. Because when the most important religious ceremonies are held in this area, these will involve all-night or multiple-night cycles with singing, with dancing, and the cycles will be passed from language to language across 6, 7, 8 languages, from musical tradition to musical tradition, and the whole ceremony can only be held by bringing everyone together. Each language, each clan, each culture has part of the puzzle. If they don't collaborate to do this, cosmos will be threatened. So it's a sort of insurance that no one is arrogant enough to think that they have a monopoly on the truth, on culture, on reality. But this diversity is fragile. You can imagine many of these languages are very small. In parts of northern Australia where I work, there are languages like Lugone, which never seem to have had more than 70 people. And they've been stable over all that time. One reason they've been able to be stable without suffering inbreeding is that you marry someone from another. That's just the norm. But to give you a more personal illustration of how fragile these languages can be, the language I worked on for my doctoral dissertation was this remarkable language called Kayardild, spoken on Little Island, Bendick Island, in northwest Queensland. In the 1940s, this was still the only language spoken by people on that island. It was a thriving vehicle of all communication. Then missionaries removed them to another island to Christianize them and punish people for using their own language. By the 1980s, when I arrived to do my doctoral research, there were only about 40 speakers left, all aged in the 40s and upwards, but you could still hear the language every day, but only spoken by adults and up, and children still there. By the 90s, there was an attempt to return to Bendick Island, the so-called outstation movement, and especially there were a lot of old ladies there speaking regularly with their grandchildren, but their grandchildren didn't really learn the language. And now, as we speak, there are just 3 old ladies left who speak it, but they're very infirm and close to death. So in the space of a lifetime, that language will disappear. And I'll give you some illustrations tonight of what it has to tell us. The article which Humberto mentioned draws partly and was inspired by initially my experience on working with this language, but every language has its own stories to tell. So diversity is enormously important, not just in linguistics, but in biology, in many other fields, in creative arts, very obviously. And I like this quote from the American sociolinguist Joshua Fishman, who says that it's just, you see the world like a tapestry. Each collectivity, each culture, each language is contributing its own thread. And it's only when we have a sense of reciprocity, of regard for what other groups know, that we will finally reach a stage of international respect. Sorry, I'm knocking. Oh, has it slipped off? I can just use it. Can you hear me okay with this one? I'll just use this. Do I get 10 extra minutes? Yeah. I think there would be people who would be deeply bored. I'll continue, but I'm sorry. Okay, so language diversity can tell us about many things. For linguists, we're interested in the variability of language itself. What do we need to account for all the different forms that languages can take? For psychologists, anthropologists, it's interesting because of the very tight interweaving of language, culture, and thought. Languages bear a close and intimate relationship to the cultures they're spoken in, and in turn, they shape our preferences in how we think in important ways. Languages can tell us an enormous amount about deep history, I won't say much about that this evening, but in a book I've written about this topic, I give the example of the Gypsies, who are a people without written history. They're not a people of the book, like the Jewish people. And it's only thanks to linguistic research that we've been able to trace their origins back to India and reconstruct the steps along their travels from India through Iran, through Turkey, Anatolia, through the Balkans, and so on, and know pretty well to the century when they reached each step along the way. And similarly, we know that the vast array of peoples from Easter Island in the Pacific across to Madagascar, from Taiwan to New Zealand, all set out from Taiwan 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, travelling down through the Philippines and fanning out. And we have a very good idea how they addressed each other, how their families were structured, how their canoes were built, thanks to evidence from language. So language can furnish us with enormously detailed information about history. When I say deep history, I mean the history before things were written down, which cuts in at different points according to where you are in the world. It can tell us a lot about traditional biological and ecological knowledge, which is transmitted through language. And it can tell us a lot if we're interested in creative issues, poetry, song, oral literature, about what people can create with language. For example, Chinese poetry, traditional poetry, requires tone to characterise the tonal patterns. You couldn't have poetic tradition in English like that. We don't have the tone to line up. On the other hand, I imagine it's quite difficult to read the limericks into Chinese, not to take the highest art form, but it's something that does depend on English rhythmical structures. So let's begin with traditional ecological knowledge. This is a scene from where I do fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, and you can see it's a pretty jungly sort of area, and you probably can't even make out the track which we have to go along, travelling about there. And there's a barely visible small bamboo knot on this tree here, known as a tab, which is like a sign. And as I was walking along this track with people, I asked them what that was supposed to signify. And they said, oh yeah, that's because there's a big poisonous brown snake in this hollow log here. I was walking along in my sandals and said, oh yeah, well, you know, how are you going to deal with this? They said, well, it's not very productive to sort of deal with these problems head on. But, you know, they get nasty. But what we do is we take the leaves of a particular herb, which is known as kiam lynch, and we chew it, and we spit that into the log every time we pass. And it's a smell which these snakes detest. So after 1 or 2 weeks, they change apartments. And then we can remove the sign and just walk along the path with a clearer mind. So that's one tiny example of detailed knowledge that traditional peoples have of their environment. I'll give you a couple more. So if you are a hunter-gatherer, you have to know the environment tremendously well. You have to see the environment as a vast and complex signalling system, allowing you to know where things are, which you're hunting or fishing or gathering. And throughout Australia, we find this phenomenon of what we call sign metonymy. So I'll go briefly into what Daniel referred to as, you know, the esoteric mode of the humanities. What this means, in simple ways, is that you'll have a word with two meanings linked together by one being a sign for the other. Proximity in time or space. So here we have bogon, which can refer to this fish, known in English as the spangled grunterfish, or the native apple, known in Linnaean taxonomy as Syzygium eucalyptoides, subspecies Glyceri. And why should they share a name? Well, the fish live in still pools underneath the overhanging branches of this tree because they like to eat these particular berries. And as the berries drop down into the water, the fish come and gobble them up. So if you're hungry and you're walking around through Arnhem Land and wanting to catch one of these fish, you look out for one of these trees. They're quite big and easy to find. It's a sort of fisherman's guide to the ecosystem there, and of obvious value if you're dependent on living off nature. So the vocabulary is a key, if you like, to lots of these relationships. Now, another way in which language transmits ecological knowledge has to do with fire. Australia is one of the great carbon emitters, and there's been a big political issue in Australia lately, trying rather weakly to reduce our carbon emissions. But one thing that's very interesting is that a lot of our emissions come from bushfires. And the nature of bushfires has changed a lot since Europeans settled Australia, because they brought a very different view of the bush, and they had no respect for indigenous methods of fire management. And it's only been recently that we've come to realise through complex calculations that if we incorporate traditional Aboriginal burning practices in managing forests of North Australia, the savanna forests, we can significantly reduce CO2 emissions. So actually some of the big carbon companies are now investing in ranger schemes that train young Aboriginal men in adopting the fire management techniques that were right on the cusp of being forgotten, which their grandparents still know. So this man here died 2 years ago, lost the Merrick, but here he is walking along with one of his grandsons on one of these training trips. And any skill, just imagine learning to play the violin or learning to drive the car, there's an aspect to it which is not verbal, just copying, but there's a large aspect to it which is transmitted through language. So here are some of the words in the Bidingunwap language relating to the dynamics of munwurk, which is a sort of landscape fire. So I won't give them all to you, but here's one, for example. Gabilidokme is the forward movement of the flame. Garabnutnum is this consumption of cured grass fuel. And Mandume, the lumbus, is the back part of the flame. And then this that you can see here is so-called patchwork burning, where you avoid having big fires by isolating patches of land and burning a cool fire there, so you just get a number of cool fires on different occasions. And that's called Garong Gawok Dalniti. So there's a whole large vocabulary of fire management there in the Bidingunwap language that's not there in English, and it allows the very efficient, accurate transmission of traditional burning practices. Let's pass now to language itself. And linguists in particular are interested in how languages can differ from each other. So Noam Chomsky's universal grammar saw all human languages as following a similar plan given by so-called universal grammar. One of the reasons he gave was that this would allow children to learn languages very quickly. We know it's a sort of miracle that whatever language children are born into, after a couple of years they're already speaking it very well without formal instruction. And his idea was that they're set up with a lot of very specific guiding hypotheses, and they just have to make a few choices to fine-tune the system, because in his view languages aren't all that different from each other. Surface diversity masks underlying uniformity on this view. So you have to push a little bit in this tradition to find out things that are supposed to be ruled out. And one, this wasn't due to Chomsky himself, but to Steve Pinker and Paul Bloom, was that no language uses noun affixes to express tense. Of course, in Chinese you don't have to worry about affixes expressing tense anyway, but if you learn English, you have to worry about tense on the verb. If you learn Kaidilt, well, the first thing is that, like in Latin or Greek or Sanskrit, who did what to who is shown by case suffixes. And word order is quite free. So when I was starting to learn Kaidilt, I said, well, how do you say, I saw the turtle, and I might have been told, nara kuri tara banga. And I did sort of frantically trying to write this down, not very successfully. Can you repeat that? Nara banga na kurita. Sorry, I didn't quite get it. Banga nara kurita. Sorry, banga na kurita nara. Kurita nara banga. Kurita banga nara. Helpfully permuting all the word orders in the hope that one of them would click for me. You can do it because the na on the end, tagged on turtle, says I am the object. I'm the one having seeing done to me, as it were. But they don't only show the object relation. To locate events in tense and possibility space in Kaidilt, you use a verb inflection like English, so kurija is saw, kuriju is will see, jara versus ju as the suffix, but you also encode this by a different suffix on the object noun itself. So bangana, which you heard me say 6 times before, jara bangana, all the other orders, but in the future tense, nara kuriju banga wu. So you're getting double marking there. Now people might say why, but we know that a certain amount of redundancy is very useful in language. That you get noise, you fail to pay attention for a second, and so on. This allows you to recover the information much more easily. So if you happen to be a child learning Kaidilt and you went in there following this stipulation that languages don't use nouns to express tense, you'd have a problem because you'd be going in with an exclusory hypothesis that wasn't borne out by the data. Whereas if you have a more open view, well, you learn it. And one of my teachers, Peter Bentic, he was telling me what happened during World War II, actually. There was an air crash and an Allied airman had the misfortune to swim ashore without his Berlitz Kaidilt language guide. And he began speaking English, and Pluto told me this in Kaidilt. He said, oh, he was crazy. He was speaking your language. And he said, this is my country. And I clubbed him on the back of the head. And he said, I said to him, you found the wrong language. I found the right language since right at the beginning, or the right words. And for every child, the language they learn is the right language. They don't have to know about all of these other things, and they have to be geared up to learn. Now, as we examine language diversity, we begin to appreciate how much fundamental technology had to be invented before we could do anything. And one of these is numerals. And we take it for granted that base 2, base 5, base 10, base 20 are sort of rational numeral systems, but all of these are totally arbitrary. So let's take the example from one part of New Guinea, first of all, which has a 27 count numeral system. So instead of just using your 10 fingers, or your 10 fingers plus your 10 toes, you start at one thumb, go up to 5 on the fingers, 6 at the wrist, 7 in the middle of the forearm, 8 at the elbow, up you go to your nose, which is the middle point, 14, then you come down the other side and get to 27. So that's how you count in this language, Oksapmi. And you can see here I've said Amun, for example, which is elbow, and then 20, which is what you get coming down the other side. Amun, the other elbow, is how you say 20. Now, I want to show you another system because I just took you through one run with Oksapmi. But if we now go to English, Chinese, which, whatever their differences, are similar in one way. We have base 10 counting systems in common, and Nen, language I'm working on in Papua New Guinea. And let's see what happens. So let's look at where the complexity lies. 10 is a nice, easy number. 36 or 216 or 7,776 are not easy numbers. So I know that Mr. Lee is a brilliant accountant, and I'm not sure. Probably he could, if I said, multiply 7,776 by itself and come up with the answer. But most people couldn't, because we're happy working with these so-called easy numbers that we're used to, but not with these complicated ones. And you can just look at the length of the English words, how many elements they have in them. The same with Chinese, you can look at the number of characters you need to represent them, so you can represent 1,000 with one character, but you take 6 characters to represent 7,776. On the other hand, if you're speaking Nen, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because there's 6 ways out of the palm of your hand, and then 7 is one hand plus 1, 9 is one hand. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a misprint there. Oh no, that's right. Let's just miss a line. 9 is one hand plus 3, and it's plus numbers. You might think that's a primitive sort of system, but then you get up to 36 or 6 squared, which is prta. So that's like 100. It's a square of the basic. And then you get up to the next power of 6, taromba, which is 216. Right? On the other hand, if you try and express 1,000 in Nen, it's very cumbersome. Sombes taromba, sombes prta, sombes. So 4 times 6 cubed plus 4 times 6 squared plus 4. But then you get your payoff again when you get to 7,776, which is just Willemaka. 6. So this is a very different solution. Elegant. You might wonder why. And in fact, it's only in southern New Guinea that you get base 6 systems. Nowhere else in the world. That's a curious fact. Base 10 systems, base 5 systems, base 20 systems are all over the place. But this is just to show you that the next door language, Aramba, goes 1 higher and it has 6 to the power 6. Nice short. Now, let's see how this could happen. There was an anthropologist called F.E. Williams, who was the government anthropologist of Papua in the 1930s, and he witnessed a yam counting ceremony. I'm going to show you a video in a moment, so I won't read through this, but the basic method is you have a human algorithm where people, 2 men, come together, each carrying 3 yams, 2 in their hands, 1 balanced on top, like a waiter carrying 3 cappuccinos, and then you have 6. You get 6 of those and pull out a counter yam on the side, and then you keep going, and then you count the counter yams, and you sort of form this sort of human abacus, base 6. So let's look at this happening. This is, well, we had the description in a book from the 1930s, but no actual recording of it happening. And the place where I work now, they don't actually do this anymore, but I have a student, Christian Bula, working on a nearby language council where people still have maintained this counting tradition, and we can watch that now. Okay, so that's the first part of it. And Being put off to the side, and on it goes. And then people are so proud. I should have said that this is your measure of being a good provider, that you're a good gardener and grow a lot of yams. So it's a mark of status to have a good yam harvest. And a good man should harvest 1,296, or 6 to the power 4 yams every year to keep in his yam store for the next year. The larger numbers are used for village feasts and things like that. So I now want you to think a little bit about how languages lead you to inhabit different speech worlds. And I think I probably don't need to say this to most of you here who move back and forth between very different languages every day. But there's a beautiful Czech proverb that says, for every language you know, you are a new person. And one of the reasons for this is that each language is exuberant in some ways. It expresses great detail about some things, and is deficient in others. It doesn't tell you, or it doesn't force you to say things that you're used to from some language. Stayed over that. So going back to Kaido briefly, in just about every sentence in Kaido, you will refer to people using the points of the compass. So if I say hello to you in Kaido, I'll say, Jinani ga waraju. And I might answer, for example, Jepuru, to the north. If you're sitting next to me in a taxi, and I might just say, squeeze over an inch so that I can plug in the seatbelt, I might say, Jekaraiwa, become a little bit in the north. Or in a conversation, I might say, ask your east uncle, as opposed to your western uncle sitting next to him. And one time I was taking an old kind of man in a very light plane, and he was talking to someone else, and he trying to persuade him to get in the plane the right way, and he said, Rain the Munkiri Leach, squeeze yourself in ass first from the south. So these things can be quite precise. And also they're omnipresent. So another of my Kaido teachers, Duwa Gungara, made up a song about this beautiful spear he'd made, and if he speared it into an imaginary turtle, so this was completely imaginary, he said, the western end of the spear would come out the other side of the turtle's throat. So even in an imaginary scene like that, he was setting it. Here, if you were to study Kaido 101 at University of Hong Kong, part of your vocabulary for tonight would be to learn a paradigm like this for each of the 4 compass points. I've only given you the ones for east, and part of what you do as a linguist is you have to find all these and record them. I won't go into them all now. Well, what difference does that make? It seems to be that speaking a language like this forces you to pay attention to the layout of the compass so thoroughly that you're permanently aware of this. That's one thing. But on top of that, it's held to be a lie to make a gesture that isn't oriented like this. So we're very lucky that two different investigators had the foresight to make videos of this man speaking the language Google Humanities, which is the language that gave us the word kangaroo. It was the first Australian Aboriginal language to be recorded by Captain Cook. And this man is telling a story on two different occasions about how the boat he was in rolled over and he had to swim ashore through shark-infested waters. And the first time he's telling a story, he said, well, the boat was lifted up. It went like this. And then the second time he told the story, he said, the boat was lifted up. It went like this. Now, he had to use a different gesture because he was facing a different way on those different recordings. If we were just writing down the language or had a sound recording, we wouldn't notice that. It's only with the video that we become aware of it. Now, researchers, especially at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, Netherlands, have devised some ingenious experiments to test whether the language you speak influences the way you think about things. So one of these tests is to take people to look at a table with some model sheep on them, and you take it to look at these, okay, 3 different types of sheep. You're led away into a different room, and the experimenter, who's a psychologist, cunningly distracts you from noticing that you're being rotated through 180 degrees, and you're given another blank table, 3 more plastic sheep, and told, put them like you saw them in the other room. And there's 2 ways you can do this. You can lay it out with the white sheep to your left, and the spotty sheep to your right. That's the so-called relative solution. And typically English speakers, for example, will do that. Or you can lay it out with the white sheep to your south and the spotty sheep to the, not to the south, to the north, which is what this solution is. But notice that now it's not on your left, but on your right. That's the so-called absolute solution. And what has been discovered with very strong statistical robustness is that in languages like Kaidu or Google Humanities, which have these very highly developed systems for locating things in the landscape in an absolute way, people will adopt the absolute response. Whereas speakers of a language like English, where we locate things left and right, adopt the relative response. It's not 100% correlation, but it's strong. Here's another language where this has been tested out on. So this is a language of Namibia, which is rather similar, and you can see from the shadows on the table that this young boy, this is Gobo said, was given this layout here, and then taken around to the other side of the house, asked to lay it out, and even though the little sheep was on his left here, now it's on his right, but it's still in the northeast. Sorry, it's, no. Oh yeah, well that's just the real thing we rotated the compass points there. Still in the northeast quadrant of the table. That's just summing up what I've said. So I want to finish by looking at one more issue, which is more how language is used creatively. And Ken Hale, who's one of my heroes, an American linguist who's worked in many parts of the world, and Australia now unfortunately deceased, wrote these very insightful lines that many forms of verbal art, the creative use of language, depend on the particularities of the language. And in such cases, the art could not exist without the language. So I want to look at a special form of language known as Damin, also from Mornington Island in Queensland. And this was taught to 2nd degree initiates. So men who've reached a certain age in their life, they go through a first initiation, which is basically circumcision and some other stuff. 2nd degree of initiation, they go through a rather painful procedure known as subincision, whose details I won't go into. And they also have to learn this special language. Damim literally means means of inquiry, or that by which it is asked. And it's held to have been invented by an ancestral fish, yellow trevally fish. Has many unusual sounds, and some of them aren't found in any other language of the world. Here's Ken Hale with Lindsay Ruffsey, who was one of the last men who could speak that, now also deceased, unfortunately. But this is what it sounds like. In normal Largo, if I say, I will eat fish, I will say, nada, jido, yako, typical sort of Aboriginal language sound. If I say it in Damim, I say, didido, dingo. So there's unusual sounds there. Clicks like you get in African languages, and a special sound which is known to linguists as an ingressive lateral fricative and is only found in this language. Like if you play the mouth organ, you breathe out, you breathe in, that sort of sound. Now, in addition to its interesting sounds, Damim is a beautiful solution to a long-standing philosophical problem. That is, philosophers and linguists have for centuries been seeking the so-called alphabet of human thought. What are the basic concepts which we can break things down to? This is a project which the Catalan philosopher Ramon Llull began in the 14th century. Descartes chewed at the problem. Leibniz had a go at it. You can see Chinese radicals as related, a partial solution to this problem. But then, if you look at Chinese characters, only about 70% of them are entirely semantically composed. So if we add simple characters to so-called logogrammic or ideogrammic compounds, then that gives us about 13%. So the problem is still 87% unsolved as a representation. But still, we have these radicals here. Now, we go to Damim, and it comes closer to solving this problem than any other solution I know of. It's the only successful attempt to develop a spoken language that can say everything using fewer than 200 elements. And this was developed in a culture where people didn't have clothes. They had about 18 items of material culture. People sat in the dust eating fish. They had a lot of time to discuss these problems. One of the beauties of doing linguistics is you encounter people who unfortunately are disregarded and despised by national governments, but are magnificently intelligent, inquiring minds who have a lot to teach us. What they know is going to be buried a lot of the time. Now let's just look at how this works. I'll give you 3 examples of Damim words. So the first one is fluid, and that means fluid or liquid. And if you learn the mappings, that word corresponds to muka, water, wunda, rain or cloud, mela, sea or salt water, ganda, blood, and galtir, urine. Didi means to act upon, causing some physical change. So chopping, biting, blowing on, breaking, cutting, cutting down, making an object by cutting, cooking and burning are all forms of didi. And didi, with a long first vowel, is to act upon, causing some change of position. Entering, or it can also be just changing position, according to the syntactic frame. Getting up, speaking, that is moving your meanings across. Catching, getting or obtaining, following, I won't go through them all. Eating, moving something from outside your body into it. Mechi is to call someone by a kinship term, but you're placing them in the social universe. Stealing, obviously. So this is invisible wealth. It's intellectual wealth, which sadly, as an Australian, you have to see that for 200 years there was a tragic history of despising and not seeing this. People looked poor, they looked primitive, and missionaries, government agents, others just bulldozed in and got rid of languages, punished people for speaking them, made no effort to record them, write them, and so on, and were totally blind and deaf to the existence of marvellous systems like this. So as Ken Hale put it, from the point of view of standard average white Australian, all the way to the top, Damien was not visible. A lot of people had no wealth apart from their land. Intellectual wealth is invisible and inaudible. So, luckily, in the last couple of decades, the community of linguists around the world has begun waking up to this. There have been international programs like the DOVIS program, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation, producing research in many parts of the world. Here's research by Gavin Kaplitz and others in the Marquesas. Here's research among Kuikuru people in Brazil, where Kuikuru speakers have really taken on the enterprise of recording and documenting their language themselves. And having painstakingly gained this material, it then needs to be archived. Otherwise you record material and it just gets lost again. So part of the enterprise has been developing electronic digital archives able to store all of this material. Now just concluding briefly by looking at the situation in this part of the world, I think that the need for work like this is especially acute in China. There's rapid socio-economic change, which is encouraging linguistic assimilation, encouraging people to see their ancestral tradition as worthless. And there have been national policies that lump together small ethnic groups. So since 1991, there's been a freezing of the number of recognised Mintu at 56. That's how many there are said to be under official policy. But if we look at what's actually there, there's probably more underreported diversity or undetected diversity in China than in any country in the world. And we know this because if you look at Ethnologue, which is a worldwide catalogue of the languages of the world, and look at the number of new entries, there have been more new entries for China than for any other part of the world in the last 2 decades. So here's an example. Someone called Jamin Pelke did his PhD at La Trobe University in Melbourne in 2005-2006 in 41 mountain villages of Yunnan province, and before he began work, all of these people were lumped together as Yi. And he found that, the figures here, he found 18 new so-called Pula languages there. And his supervisor, David Bradley, suspects that Yunnan alone, just Yunnan province, probably has more than 150 languages. We don't know yet. That work needs to be done. So it's highly likely that we'll see an explosion of known language in China, as long as we act quickly. It's a giant enterprise. I know myself that working on an undescribed language takes 5, 6, 7 years of your life. It's typically a big doctoral project, and that's only the beginning. Maybe you've written a grammar, but you haven't finished a dictionary yet. But I hope to have shown that it's deeply rewarding and fascinating work. So even with the support of all of these major worldwide organisations, a big push among linguists over the last couple of decades, say we have several hundred linguists around the world doing this sort of work, we only have proper scientific documentation for fewer than 10% of the world's languages. This term logosphere, which the linguist Mike Krauss coined to think, just like the biosphere is the sphere of all life, the logosphere is the sphere of all languages and what they have to tell us. It risks vanishing without or with very few traces. So we need more initiatives to support the preservation of this fragile knowledge, and we especially need the chance to train young linguists to the world's best standards, and I know that this is beginning to happen here, and I'm very excited to see that. I hope it's going to be something that happens much more into the future. So thank you very much for listening.
Nick, thank you so much. That was a fascinating lecture. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So I would ask you to keep your questions as questions and short and sweet, but you can ask it in any language that you like. So that's fine. We do have a mic.
Okay, to make it quick. So my question basically is concerns the way the relationship between dialect and language, and that is how the rich diversity of languages in China, they are underreported or kind of become invisible. So like there is a language called Serpa, is regarded as a language outside China when it's studied in Nepal. It's also spoken in Tibet or in China, but in China they're regarded only as a Tibetan dialect. And the same happens to the, numerous Chinese dialects, so-called Chinese dialects. So if you just look at even the Chinese or Semitic side, it's very diverse itself. Thank you.
So, linguists tend to use the word dialect and language differently to the ways, the lay public and the way political organisations do. And for us, there's still no single test which will always determine the answer, but mutual comprehensibility is an important part of it. The question of whether you could, in principle, write a single grammar, a single dictionary, maybe with some notes on variability, or whether you would need to give a different description, is another sort of good test. Of course, the situation's complicated by the unique Chinese system of having a shared writing system for what would be different spoken languages in a linguist's standard view. So you might say for China, probably this would be the commonest view among a linguist, that there's a single written language relating to several spoken languages when we're talking about Han varieties. But there's also been, I'd say, a general policy of subsuming what would be a language by any criteria, because they're not even written, under so-called dialects, basically for reasons of political convenience, in the sense that it's hard for a central government to deal with too many units. Anyone who runs a university or a faculty knows that you can't have 1,084 faculties in a university or 1,084 departments in a faculty. So you get schools or other sort of groupings to sort of compact things together. And that's fine. I mean, that's an administrative question. But the scientific question of what the units are should be kept distinct from it.
Other questions?
Yes, thank you. This is extraordinary tour de force. I wonder, it sort of senses that, very, very thought-provoking and convincing examples of sort of loss of deep, folk common sense knowledge theory that is, a result of what David Christian, historian, calls our collective brain that is thanks to language. So the sort of sense of the loss of diversity of worldviews, using sort of Michael Halliday's notion of functions of language. So this is in the ideational realm. I'm sort of construing our experience of the world in multifaceted ways. I wonder what's your sense of the sort of interpersonal complement to that? I mean, modes of interaction, modes of being, how these are being lost, and the diversity of sort of conflict resolution getting on, and different forms of mateship and so on. You referred to kinship systems and so on.
Yes. So if I could just give two very brief examples. In the interpersonal realm, we've got a project at the moment on grammar and social cognition, where these are key parts of it. And one has to do with how languages encode social information in their grammars. So an example I nearly put into the PowerPoint and then decided I was going to be over length came from Nahi and some other languages of southern China, which have special so-called family group classifiers along normal classifiers. And the family group classifier will combine with a numeral, and then one kin term. So I might say something like to family group classifier grandmother to mean a group of two containing a grandmother. So it might be a grandmother and a grandchild, for example. Three family group classifier grandmother could be a grandmother and two grandchildren, or a grandmother, her daughter, the mother, and then a child, and so on. So this is a unique grammatical phenomenon that's just appeared in some of these Yunnan languages a few years ago. In terms of just conversation, Western-based logic ultimately deriving from the Greek tradition derives from the grammatical categories that Greek and other classical languages happened to have: mood, tense, and so on. They were placed at the top. It didn't take the act of conversation as the prime. But now we're starting to discover languages in Colombia, in New Guinea, in Tibet, in several parts of the world, where the first grammatical specification that goes on a verbal inflection is, I know this, but I don't expect you do. I know this and I think you do as well. I don't know this, I think you do, can you help me? I don't know this, I don't think you know either, can we get someone else? And so on. That is that they track the epistemic partition between speaker and hearer. And I think these are going to have revolutionary effects as we begin to discover these languages more. At the moment, we've just got them there as sort of rather isolated specimens, verb paradigms and so on. But what we need to go on is to see how they're deployed in actual conversation. So that's two tiny examples as a partial response to your question.
We have one last question.
Yes, I was fascinated by the account of the languages you document, of the natural world, of the ecological information that they've recorded. And I was thinking of Claude Lévi-Strauss's claim in La Pensée Sauvage that the speakers he had studied of various sorts actually taxonomized everything. It wasn't simply a matter of interacting with the immediate practicalities, that they were actually extremely, they exhibit this immense curiosity and desire actually to know the whole and its parts. And I was just wondering if there was anything like that you saw that went beyond the merely practical immediacy of their lives to show this kind of, real desire to understand nature in this very deep and detailed way.
Yeah, I think that that aspect of his work was spot on. That is the image one could readily have of small peoples as isolated and sort of ground down by the cares of life and so on. Ignores the incredibly rich and curious philosophical traditions they have. When you look at the natural world, with Damin I could have given you examples of that, of how that's used to classify things, but I'll give you another example from a different initiation language in Walbury again, called Diliwiri. And to learn Diliwiri, you go in, you're initiated, you hear people saying weird things that seem to be upside down somehow. And after a while you realise that every word is being substituted by its opposite. So instead of saying, I'm sitting on the ground, I say, you're standing in the sky, for example. Now, that's already interesting. But as a linguist, you think, well, we teach semantics every year. We get up there and teach our semantics students about antonyms, about opposites. I've taught semantics many times. I've never once had a question posed to me by a student which is the question Diliwiri poses. That is, does every word have an opposite? Because, a typical chapter in a semantics textbook gives some nice examples, dead, alive, tall, short, and so on. What would it be like to find an opposite for everything? What's the opposite of to see, for example? What happens in Diliwiri? There's just a few special words that get created for words that don't have a natural opposite. Something like to be blocked. So to be blocked, eye, except you take the opposite of eye, which is ear, is to see. And see, you use the word see, and that means to to be deaf, because it's to be blocked, but with respect to the opposite of eye, which is ear. And then when you go into the natural world, you go down through a taxonomy, like the Linnaean taxonomy of organisms. What's the opposite of a white-breasted sea eagle, for example? It'll be another eagle, like a wedge-tailed eagle or something like that. So this is something that takes a very interesting semantic idea, you can call it philosophical idea, and pushes it to the limit. It doesn't just do it halfway, it goes all the way. People delight in it. And you discover this sort of thing again and again in the languages of the world. I mean, I know about it best for Aboriginal examples, but you see impressive examples from other places. So I close my book, actually, The Dying Words, by citing that Gilligwood example, because I think that the act of doing language documentation is where you sit in the dust, but you stand in the sky in terms of getting that view of human potentiality and of all the things which all the world's languages allow us to understand.
Well, Dick, thank you so much for opening our eyes to the richness of language and the diversity of language. We just have to say thank you with a small gift here. So thank you very much. It's a wonderful...